So, this episode today is actually based on the last book that I read in 2024, and I had been meaning to read it for a while, but it just never happened. It's called Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence. And it's by Shrayana Bhattacharya, an economist at the World Bank's Social Protection and Labor Unit for South Asia. Actually, it was my former colleague Aksha, the host of our early careers podcast called The First 2 Years, who lent me this book before she left Bangalore. I think it was a few months ago now. Thank you, Aksha, for lending me this book, and I swear I will return it to you. Now, if you're a reader, you can tell how a book really holds value when somebody has earmarked it, underlined it. It says so much about not just how engaging the book is, but also about how its words have been cherished, they've been savored, because there is just so much truth in them. When I got the book from Aksha, there were sentences underlined from front to back. So, in Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, Shrayana tries to understand the economic and social situation of women in India through the lives of 10 women. 10 women who come from completely different backgrounds, different castes, different classes, different careers, from an upper caste engineer to a flight attendant to a Muslim garment worker to a migrant woman from a tribal region who is a domestic worker. She followed all of them for over a decade, and to this day, some of them still remain her friends. Now, if you've not read the book, you may be wondering, where does Shah Rukh Khan fit into all of this? And why does an economist who works for the World Bank care about the actor Shah Rukh Khan? First of all, Shrayana is a fan herself, and as she puts it, Shah Rukh Khan became a research method for her. Because the only common thing between all these women was their love for Shah Rukh. So Shrayana basically dumped all the boring, usual academic styles of research, and she studied these women's fandom of the actor. And she found that for each one of them, he symbolizes something different. For someone, he is the symbol of professionalism. For another, he stands for hope, hope for upward mobility, irrespective of where you're born. The book gives us a glimpse into the everyday battles that all of these women fight for their independence. Shrayana shows us how the icon of Shah Rukh Khan, not Shah Rukh Khan himself, represents economic liberalisation and how he, in a way, is a bearer of the market. Such a fascinating and telling book. I don't want to give away too much, but let me just put it this way. As a millennial Indian woman who is not married, who is in her 30s, who loves her job and is dealing with the consequences of not fulfilling traditional societal expectations, this book made me feel so seen. So, obviously, I wanted to get Shrayana on Daybreak, and she actually agreed. In this episode, we talk about Shah Rukh Khan, of course, about the role of women in the Indian economy, where they stand now, and as Shrayana likes to call it, dal-sabzi feminism, the economics of chick, and a lot more. Stay tuned. Welcome to Daybreak, a business podcast from the Ken. I'm your host Nigda Sharma, and I don't chase the news cycle. Instead, every day of the week, my colleague Rahel Philippos and I will come to you with one business story that is worth understanding and worth your time. Today is Friday, the 3rd of January 2025. Shriyana, thank you so much for finding the time to join us today. And I think it's been over 3 years, right, since you wrote this book and it came out. And I have to admit, I only read it recently. And wow, as a reader of mostly fiction, I never imagined I would find a book that is essentially about economics so interesting.
Yeah, so firstly, Snigdha, thank you so much for inviting me. In fact, particularly at this time of the year, and hi to everyone listening. And I hope everybody has a wonderful end of year and wishing everyone a good 2025 as well. Yes, Snigdha, it's been 3 years since Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh came out. I can scarcely believe it. It feels like just yesterday. and 2025 will be 4 years since its release.
Also, just like how you say in the book, right? Like Shah Rukh Khan makes his women fans feel seen. This book made me feel so seen as a woman who was born in the 90s, and even though I know I'm a small cog in the economy machine, I think this is something that everybody says about your book as well, and they appreciate it. It's not the usual boring academic kind of writing that you read where people are just basically reduced to data sets, especially when it comes to anything related to economics. How did you figure out that you were going to write like that?
Thank you so much, Nikita. I have to say the reason I wrote it because I'm trained in economics. I wanted to write a book about what's happened to women in the Indian economy,
Mhm.
but I was so tired. I think maybe because of the way general economic literature and financial literature tends to write about these issues. I wanted to just write it in a very different way, which would feel like, I know it sounds strange, but like I wanted economics to offer almost like comfort and a hug to anyone who was reading it. Because I wanted to actually explain to people who were reading it that there's a reason why a lot of women are dealing with a kind of structural loneliness, actually, especially those in the labor market. And it has a lot to do with what's happening, the underpinnings of our economy. And I just wanted to give people a sense of that. And then if Mr. Shah Rukh Khan could be a conduit to do it, that was more fun. But I'm glad that you reacted the way you did, because that was really my hope with the book, to make economics accessible, but also explain, I think, in a more fun way, how the economy is making many of us feel lonely and the structure of it. So I'm glad you picked up on that.
Yeah, of course. I actually remember there was this piece that you wrote. I think it was for The Guardian about your book. And you mentioned how, Shah Rukh Khan came into the picture while you were doing your research. And I think there was this woman that you were interviewing, and she told you that she thought that your questions are kind of boring and like, you're not going to really get anything out of it, right?
Yeah, no, so the research started, I think, I write about this. It started in what, my God, it feels like, 15, 16 years ago. Now it's actually more than 16 years. It is coming up to be 20 years. And I remember I was in Ahmedabad. I was doing a survey of women who make incense sticks,
Yeah.
agarbatti at home, and
Yeah.
they're earning barely minimum wage. And I remember when I started the interview, they just, exactly as you said, they were just so bored, because they said, "Why are you asking us all these questions about our wages, hours of work? People have asked us these questions in the past and nothing has changed. So can we talk about something more fun?" So I just started asking people about their favorite film star, because I was struggling. I was trying to figure out what's the way to handle this situation,
Yeah.
because the traditional survey had really broken down. And then when I started asking people about their favorite actors, so many women mentioned Mr. Khan, and I love him. And I started asking them about why they loved him. And you realize, as you heard the stories, they were talking about how difficult it was for them to have money, freedom, safety, to be able to just, enjoy their fandom.
Yeah.
And it was a rupture. I really never expected to accidentally hit upon this, but I did.
Right. Shreyana, tell me about your own fandom of Shah Rukh Khan. I really want to know what was it like before you wrote this book, before you started the research, and did it kind of change afterwards?
I don't think my fandom for him is, particularly special. I mean, I think I am just your regular vanilla Shah Rukh Khan fan. And if you see in the book, there's a very particular shape I think fandom takes, especially for women who are elite, educated. We live in cities, have much more access to media. And I think for us, it's often I'd hear it was a very common, quote that I'd hear, which is, "Oh, I love his interviews more than I love his films," and, so on and so forth. And I think this would be true for me as well, right up in the beginning. But, as I followed the lives of the women I did, and, in the book, I follow essentially 10 lives for 15 years. And the struggles that so many of these women, particularly those from sort of the emerging middle class, our economic precariat as well, the struggles that these women endeavored with and dealt with just to be able to watch, their favorite actor. It's a very simple, economic transaction, just being able to pay to watch a movie or be able to have a
Yeah.
mobile phone to like listen to your favorite song. But you see the struggles over the decades that I followed these women. And I think now I see Mr. Khan very differently. For me, he is now a metaphor for that kind of purchasing power, economic freedom, social and sexual freedom as well, right? For so many of these women to just express their desires, talk about them openly,
Correct.
own their own aspirations, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, he's no longer, I find it really funny when people, I think we spend too much time in our culture, I think, dissecting what actors say and where they go and what they do and so on. I can't connect to that kind of analysis. And, I'm not a film studies person at all. So I don't see him as, a person I have to analyze. And to be perfectly
Hmm.
honest, I'm too biased a fan to analyze him as well. I don't have
Right.
the talent to do it, nor do I have the distance.
Yeah.
But what I do know now is when I see him, I just think of all these struggles. I think of all these, home based textile workers I knew who saved, 5 to 10 rupees every week, right, to be able to watch and organize a screening in their village of a film of theirs because it was not safe for them to be outside the village watching a film in a cinema hall.
Absolutely. Movie halls are still male dominated spaces, especially when you go to smaller towns and cities, right? They're not the safest spaces for women. So I get it. What does it take for a woman in India to be a Shah Rukh Khan fan? There is a price that has to be paid, and it's not just money, right? So, Shriyana, what does Shah Rukh Khan mean to you as an economist and as the writer of this book, and also to the 10 women that you followed?
To me, he is now a research method. He is a metaphor for all these struggles and a way to explore female freedom, as I said, sexual, bodily freedom, economic autonomy, the searching for romantic and personal and spiritual happiness in different ways. But I do think that because the book kind of it writes about, and I think I approached the question in a different way, right?
Hmm.
It wasn't about Mr. Khan, it's about the lives of these women.
Yeah.
And you see that when they're talking about him, no one is gushing about him in that, they're gushing about him, but you just take one step further, right? And ask any of these women, when did you watch Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, for example, or how did you watch Shah Rukh Khan for the first time? And you discover these remarkable stories because watching him, especially for women who don't come from a lot of privileges that we do,
Hmm.
really marks very important milestones in their lives. For them, I actually say this in the book that for so many of them, they measure their independence with the number of cinema tickets they've
True.
been able to purchase for
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
And I think this is true for so many women, right? Like we kind of measure, not even women, men, everyone. We measure our independence in these different ways. I think the economy offers us a way to also, enjoy our liberties, right? And I think you realize through the book that it's so difficult for so many of these women. So I think for me, I think it's been a very interesting journey just to see people actually realize that it's not about him per se, it's about all these women and how he allows them to talk about themselves.
Right. Also, for too long, the focus, especially when it comes to, this kind of literature and research, is on the deprived, the suffering, the poor. It's always the weakness that is highlighted. And that is why your book was so refreshing in that sense as well. And plus, to me, as an upper caste privileged woman in India, it was also kind of a mirror. It showed me things that I never thought about, and I think it did the same to even your upper caste privileged characters, right? You did the same thing. Like, I loved the discomfort, that it made me feel.
And you're right, it also then allows us protections, right? Because then we can sort of say, oh, we as extremely privileged academics are writing about the lives of other people who are so different. But I wanted to meld that. One thing I had decided right up in the beginning, talking to mentors who had helped me shape the book, was that whatever I was going to write about these other women, be it their economic lives, sex lives, personal lives, I would write about myself. Not, I think, just as a way of showing reciprocity in the text, because I didn't. The book was never about me, but I did want to open up the class profile of analysis.
Yeah, that is what makes this book so different. And I really feel, that it is one book that will stand the test of time. And actually, speaking about class and caste of all these women that you wrote about, could you also please tell our listeners about just how different the worlds that these women occupy are, and how, the only common thing, of course, was, like, you discovered their love for Shah Rukh Khan?
For example, the book is divided, I mean, as you know, into sort of four sections, right? And the four sections really travel the different income quintiles actually in the country. It starts with the hyper elite, maybe the top 10%, moves then to the middle 40%, and then the last sections are about, our bottom 20%. And if you actually do look at the book, it is layered that way. And what's interesting is, if you talk to elite women, typically upper caste, in the book, and there's one young woman who is, her name's Vidya in the book.
Yeah, super interesting character, Vidya, I have to say. And you laid out all the conflicts so well with her, as a character in a book.
Yeah. To her and to people, like, I think this might be true for many of us who are of a certain upper economic echelon. He really represents this idea of, merit, right? We're so obsessed with this idea that he made it without any networks, without any support, without perhaps recognizing, and I talk about this all the time, she and I kept arguing about this, which is that all of us come from so much network based privilege because of our caste networks, our own inherited privileges, right? And yet, there's this valorization, which I understand, of this man who's really made it without the same connections. And I think for her, I think what she is really reacting to is funnily enough, the thing that we don't talk about perhaps enough is also, weirdly, inequality in our top 10% has also skyrocketed, right? It's not that I have any sympathy for it, because I mean, it means close to nothing given the rate of inequality across the country. But if you look at the top 10%, the difference between, say, the 0.01% and the rest of the sort of 9.9% is really growing, and the data shows it, right? And I think what she is reacting to, Vidya, is that.
Yeah, and she's constantly comparing herself to this college frenemy that she has, right? Whom you, in the book, you refer to her as the student. And this student, she comes from this super rich Delhi family with a lot of property and, connections to important, influential people, like really, really posh background, right?
Yeah. And Vidya, I think, looks at her and says, well, I don't have that. Although they're part of the same 10%, top 10%, she sort of makes this distinction. And it is an accurate distinction. Vidya is not a property owning person in that
Yeah, and she's
10%.
paying off her father's debt also
Exactly.
at
And
some
she
point.
supports herself, which is different, right? And so to her, so for example, for Vidya, who's in sort of the top 10% of our economy, for her, he is very much a symbol of that struggle, right? To have your own connections, to have your own home, to have more comforts than your family before had. And so there's always this idea of, he's the guy who made it, right? And people in the top 10% who keep calling themselves middle class, which is always very
Yeah.
funny. And so I think she comes at him from that perspective. So that's one, right?
Yeah, and then there is the other extreme that you also write about in the book.
Yeah. For example, if you go to the end of the book, there's, the women I started the book with, right? These home-based agarbatti makers, textile workers. I go to the villages of Uttar Pradesh and Rampur, where women make home-based textiles and do garment work.
Hmm.
And for these young women, having a mobile phone is like an exotic new thing. I mean, I met them in sort of, this is 2006, 7, 8, 10, that period.
Yeah.
And for them at that point, just being able to organize a screening in their home to watch Shah Rukh Khan, they all organize this around Eid. They all want to watch Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge or some other
Yeah.
movie. You realize that for them, fandom and these aspirations look very different. For them, it's just, the ability to just have fun, unabashedly have fun, have the economic space, the personal space to just do so, right? And
Mm.
and it looks so different, right? Fandom
Yeah.
there.
Absolutely.
And then, my favorite stories actually, now that I take a step back, is actually the women in the middle, sort of the emerging, first generation of the middle class
Right.
in India, the
Yeah.
fledgling middle class.
Hmm.
There's a person I write about her. She chose to call herself Gold. All the women,
Yeah.
chose their own
Yeah.
pseudonyms, and she's an in-flight attendant who
Mhm.
really, around the time the economy opened up, and aviation really boomed, right? Private airlines and so on. Suddenly, you had all these jobs in aviation, and she took advantage of that, and she ran away from her home because she didn't want an arranged marriage that her family was planning for her, and she goes off to have her own adventure of independence, and it's
Yeah.
not easy. It's a very tough life, and for her, strangely, she loves Mr. Khan and all his, the obsessive lover films, because
Yeah.
she feels so jilted and lonely in her own love life when she's dealing with the mating market in Gurgaon, which is where she moves to.
Yeah.
She keeps saying all these men are such jerks that I just want to harm them. And I know it sounds awful, but you realize for her, she's looking at him in a way of someone who really nurtures her through her loneliness. She
Yeah.
watches and memorizes all the things he said about feeling lonely himself in his documentaries and his interviews. And so
Yeah.
for her, she's constructed her fandom completely out of the interviews and these other pieces of
Mhm.
media.
Actually, that actually, Vidya, it reminds me of my own perception of Shah Rukh Khan, which is more based on interviews than his movies, I would say. And somebody had asked him a question about philosophy or something like that, and he's like, make money first, and then you can philosophize later. And I really like the fact how he's so open about making money, because especially upper caste and upper class people, they think it's cheap, to speak directly about money, right? um okay, anyway, coming to these women that you were following for so long, Shana, what are some of the common things? We spoke about all the differences. What are some of the common things that you see in them, despite all the different background and context and everything, obviously, again, except Shah Rukh Khan?
Look, I think it's two things. The two things that I think are common in the way they talk about him, and I think it links to the way they talk about themselves. One is, everybody seems, I mean, yes, all these women are united in their love for Mr. Khan, but I think what they're actually united by is the love for their own ability to watch him. Because for them, it was a way of actuating their own personhood. We all have these preferences, and it's part of our personality, part of who we are. And I think for them, it was a way of demonstrating who they were in societies that are very uncomfortable when women start to demonstrate their desires, right? Like, I think, and even amongst our elites, I would contend this is sexual autonomy frightens Indian society so much for reasons of caste, dynamics, family, everything, right? Like, I think so much of revolution in our country is held up in women's sexual autonomy. And I think the moment all these women are talking about an actor that they think is sexy and they're discussing it openly, it creates a huge issue. And I think so to me that was one. The second, I think, linked to that is, so I think while they appreciate money and purchasing power, I think it's more the idea of having success so you can be your own person, right? So that you're not depending, as they've seen their mothers and sisters and grandmothers for many years be dependent on others and have to kind of dim down their own desires so that they can be seen as good, acceptable women. I think we are a generation of women where that is no longer acceptable. It's not acceptable in the villages of UP. It is not acceptable in the posh neighborhoods of Delhi, right? No matter where you are. And I think for me, his conversation about money and all of that is very deeply linked to that idea, right? That I mean, for a lot of these women, the economy is nothing but a place to actually find emotional footing, right? To be able to express yourself.
Exactly. And actually, that brings me to my next question. You keep talking about, how as an economist, you're more interested in the emotional state of an economy. I, for one, had absolutely no idea that, such a concept exists. And I found it so, so valid when I understood it. Like, it was. an aha moment, especially how a woman's economic independence is dependent on the emotional state of the economy. So can you explain this a little bit to us?
I firmly believe, as many, I think, economic sociologists do, that all our behaviors in the economy, spending, saving, purchasing, all of that is linked to our emotional and our social needs, right? I mean, the idea that the economy exists in some vacuum from our emotional life is just silly. I actually said this in the beginning when I was writing the book. I had sort of said to myself that the first page of the book has this graph of women's employment rates from the 1990s till the time the book came out. And it's, if you look at it as just an economic graph or a graph on, a business channel or a podcast, right? It's just a graph. I wanted the reader, by the time they finish the book, for that graph to elicit tears and emotions. They should look at there's that wonderful quote. I'm forgetting. I think people don't know who that quote comes from, but you should be able to look at a group of numbers and cry, not because, numbers are making you cry, but because you realize these numbers, be it COVID death tolls, be it the low rates of female employment, they are hiding and telling you something very deep about our society and about how lonely so many people are. Those numbers should convey emotions.
Right. Actually, I'm so grateful, that we have people who actually look at it like that. And on that note, we'll take a short break and we will be right back. Meanwhile, Rahil has something to request you.
Hey, Daybreak listener, I'm Rahil, the co host of this podcast. Are you enjoying this episode so far? If you are, then could you please spare a few seconds to rate Daybreak on your preferred streaming platform and also hit follow? We've been trying really hard to beat the algorithm gods, and a little bit of help from you will really help this podcast grow. The more visible we are, the better guests we can get on our show. You know how these things work. Thank you. And with that out of the way, let's get back to the episode.
Shana, this obviously, India has been doing alarmingly badly every year on the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Report that is published every year. This year, in fact, we slipped two places to 129th, I think. And that obviously means that women's participation in the workforce in India is not really improving as much. I want to ask you, what does this say about the Indian economy and where we are right now?
So even right now, I think we're looking at 28% of women in urban India, are in the labor force, which is, they're earning an income or they're looking for a job, compared to say 75 to 76% of urban men, right? And when you look at these numbers, one way to describe what's happening is in a very technocratic, technical way, which is useful, to say, well, there are not enough jobs, there are market forces because of which we're seeing these very low rates and these persistent gaps between men and women in the economy. And let's try and solve for those. That's great. But if we don't acknowledge that two of the key reasons we're seeing these extremely low numbers has a lot to do with the social conditioning of both boys and girls, in the way gender roles play out, right? And the fact that we still are living in a society where for most women, and it's something I think especially amongst our elite, we don't want to have an honest conversation about, and we pretend that we've changed, but I think we pretend we've changed more than we have. We like to tell ourselves that, well, we are elite, independent women, we're educated, but actually we still live in a society where even our elites are taught that a woman's primary job is marriage, is loving, is childbearing, is taking care, which are all wonderful things. I am not at all saying don't do those.
Of course, to each their own, but um, we do have to see it for what it is. Women from across classes are dropping out of the workforce because of the expectations of these fixed roles that they have to play. And even in your book, you mentioned this report by the International Labor Organization, right? That says that India right now is in the bottom five of the world when it comes to men helping with housework.
We are having a very dishonest conversation about the economy if we also don't acknowledge that for the longest time, and still so, the economy is a masculine construct. we are still living in an economy that does not reward or acknowledge women's unpaid care work. If women did not do the care work of cooking, cleaning, child caring, taking care of our elderly, there would be no economy, there would be no workers. And it is this emotion, and by the way, it's not just mechanical work, it's also the emotional nurturance that often women provide to men and women who are, productive agents in the economy, that cannot be discounted. And sadly, it has been for the longest time. We believe, and you see this in the book, that the economy exists in factories and fields. But I would contend, as many feminist economists have done, this is not a new idea, that the economy actually exists in our homes. That is where we start creating the economy. And our relationships within the home, right? About how fathers mirror behavior for young men, how mothers raised daughters versus boys. All of that has implications for the human capital that we are accruing for the way we behave in the economy. And I really wanted that emotional life to be much more clear to readers. So, when you see numbers and you say there are these gaps, I wanted to explain to people that those gaps actually mean a lot of tears for a lot of women. You see how anguished so many young women are in the book, because they're not able to keep up, wanting to be economically independent, to do the things that they want to do, right, with their bodies, their minds, their careers, their lives. And even for women who do, nurture careers, how miserable I think this kind of emotional conditioning makes them, that they constantly feel lonely.
Absolutely. If we break the norms, it's like not getting married, for example, or not having children. We are perceived to be, or we are made to feel inadequate in some way.
In the book, I use this framework. It comes from Sendhil Mullainathan, who's a wonderful economist. He sort of calls it an emotional tax, which is anytime women start to deviate from that very traditional caregiver role, or deviate from being like the good, dutiful woman, there are taxes that our society and sometimes our loved ones impose on us. They may not love us as much, right? And we feel that. They may judge us. There may be scrutiny on our behavior. And I think the tax is very high for many women. And so often, when we think about the way people are navigating decisions in the labor market, it's not just price signals, right, that people are reacting to. People are reacting to these emotional rents and taxes as well. Men, by the way, it's the same. So many men would say, I don't want to be in this like terrible job. I'd rather just, be doing something else. But they need to signal masculinity to earn love as well in the economy by behaving in certain ways, which can often be extremely aggressive. But I don't think it's because anybody is, sort of morally defunct. It's, I think we're all reacting to these very different signals that society is throwing at us. And the economy is only a place, right? It's a subset of society.
Exactly. And that explains why you can't just look at economic data as just numbers and what you've been talking about the whole time. It is very important to understand these undercurrents, these emotions and societal constructs that kind of shape these numbers.
I sort of say in the book that, like so many of us, I followed all these mother daughter pairs through the book, right? There's so many. And I actually say that there are these intimate revolutions. And I was inspired by Claudia Golden, who's won the Nobel recently. She has this idea, she calls it a quiet revolution in America. And what she basically says was that when the revolution for gender norms in America didn't happen just when women started participating in the workforce. I think for her, what she says is the real revolution happened when women's aspirations of who they were as people weren't just about their family and their loved ones, but were also about their careers, their other interests, right? Could be their hobbies. I mean, could be many other things. It doesn't have to just be a job, it could be anything. And I think to her, that idea of personhood, when it started to change, that is when societies really started to change.
Yeah, and it is kind of happening already, right? Very slowly, but it is happening, right?
Yeah, girls are marrying much later. Many girls are choosing not to marry. Girls are marrying outside their own community for their own choice, right? Boys in the family are much more supportive of women who want to be outside the home. And there are so many women in the book who say that they're raising boys differently, right? And I think these are very small. I call it sort of dal-sabzi feminism. It's not feminism that's catchy. It'll never be on a magazine cover. It won't win an award. But I think this is actually the sum and substance of long-term sustained social change. It's all these smaller, incremental, intimate changes in our everyday behaviors, in our families, and also in our workplaces. And I think it takes a long time. And as we said, the history of the arc of this kind of change is very long. I've been very privileged that I've actually been able to document it in these sort of 10 lives, right? That And you see this where they were when they started their careers and where they are when the book stops. Everybody in their immediate families has completely been radically transformed by the simple act of these women just getting up and going to work every day.
Absolutely. And all of this kind of ties up to the idea of what you call the labor of love, which is so interesting.
This kind of social change is also hard work. And it's often women who have to put in this kind of labor. So it's not just the labor of care and caregiving and emotional support, but it's also realizing that, if you are a first generation woman in your community, which almost all the women in my book are, who are stepping out of the home and earning their own money, that's a very radical act in all these places. If you are the first woman in your family to have a poster of Shah Rukh Khan, which very clearly signals in a conservative society that you think a man is sexy and you like the way he looks, you are signaling your sexual autonomy. That is a radical act, and that is laborious, because what it means is there will be judgment, there will be a lot of negotiation. There's like what, the economics of chick, I think is the best way to describe it. There's so much like, explaining. And so many of these women, you see that they're constantly having to explain, adjust, accommodate, bargain. And it is these intra-household bargains, and they are laborious. And these are the labors of love, right? Like that you don't want to necessarily completely walk out of your family and loved ones. You want to explain to them that you want to live life differently. And I think it links back to Mr. Khan, because is it really that surprising then that, in such a masculine economy, where most decision making systems when it comes to our politics as well as our economy are managed by largely upper caste men, is it really that surprising that so many women who are choosing to participate in this economy uh, need a soppy, beautiful actor to like watch as release? And they want to watch him like, express love to women and have his arms wide open and all that, right? Which looks to some people is ridiculous. But I understand now that that imagery holds a lot of emotive appeal, because we make it really hard for women who want to step outside the home. Our society does not make it easy. And I think whenever it's not easy, for the women in my book, as I said, it's Mr. Khan, but I think others will find other forms of comfort and escape.
Right. Okay, Shana, just one last question. Change is happening. Yes, we can see it in our everyday lives. And as a privileged upper caste woman, uh, just putting it out there, I see way more women out and about. But again, women's participation is still below 40% in the Indian workforce. We are falling on the global gender gap index. It's quite shameful. So, I find these two realities very hard to kind of understand, together.
Yeah, so I think how that's happening is that we're a very large country where, almost by neighborhood and by geospatial coordinates, you're living in a different reality. So what's happening essentially is that I describe this in the book, that amongst an extremely upwardly mobile, educated set of women, they are careerist, you see them all around you. Um, they're in the paid workforce, you see this change happening. You also see this kind of there is a feminization increasingly also of the public sphere. We are voting much more, right? We're on television a lot. I mean, we dominate, right? So much of the media landscape, you see women. And I think that uh, what's happening is, so that there's a lot of that, but then the unfortunate part is that's also a very small subset of the economy, right? Because there's a whole, actually 80% of the economy which is in the informal sector, where women are participating but struggling, to have the same earnings, suppose, in self-employment as men. So I think the first way to, I think, explain that is to understand that, I often say this sort of India is, it's not a country, it's a continent. And I think the numbers are collapsing so many realities into one that they're a bit hollow. So I think the interesting thing, for example, to think about is that in the northeastern states, female employment rates have historically always been high, right? And in many. And then you have certain regions where the rates have been low and continue to be so. So I think there is that nuance in the way we need to think about this. Can numbers increase? They already have, Snigdha. So, I mean, economists would say since 2021, our female employment rates have increased. So, rural India has gone from a third to now nearly half. It's like 47% women in the labor force. Um, Even urban rates have increased from sort of lower 20s to now it's about 28%.
But you said, that you are still hopeful, right? Like, I want to ask, what are you hopeful about?
There are countries where you've seen these increases, right? Like the Chinese went from, foot binding to one of the extremely high female employment rates. But I think three things really have to happen if you look at the history of those countries. And I think those three, if we can start to relax some of those constraints, I think it can really revolutionize the numbers. I think one is we really need a dedicated strategy to make care work more remunerative, less onerous. Um, I really hope men step up in the kitchen, but I'm not holding my breath. And I think in that world, maybe more subsidies to automated ways to manage some of that care work, more public investment. India still doesn't spend as much on care. Providing subsidies and incentives perhaps to businesses that offer care solutions, be it elderly care, child care, right? Making those businesses more lucrative, paying care workers well so that it's a good, dignified, solid job that so many women are doing and they deserve recognition for it. I think the second is we really do need to think much more cohesively, and I think this has started to happen in many states, for incentives for the private sector to also prioritize women. It could look in very different ways, because what we know from the history of the country is that, for example, the top 10 fastest growing sectors in India for the longest time, only about 16 to 18% of jobs in those sectors went to women. And I think we need to create incentives for the private sector to also be more mindful, right? I do think that conversation has started. I mean, so many places I go to, I see government as well as the private sector being mindful of the fact that they want to hire more women, and not just because they want to hire for more women to check a box, but because they actually think the skill sets that they need are much more suited. And the third, which I think is the most important, is even if you have, and we see this, right? Even if you have the private sector wanting to hire women, and even if you relax the constraints of care at home, I think the problem is most jobs in India are clustered in certain areas. So for women, they'll have to migrate to those cities, they'll have to travel. And the two markets that really hate, and I say this, very clearly hate single women, and particularly are housing and transport. Being I am, a single woman, extremely privileged, but even for me to be able to find a house that is safe, I have to live in a neighborhood where I pay much higher rent than, say, men who have similar jobs as mine, right? Because I have to sort of, there's a safety premium there. So I think unless we don't get some of those markets right and working for women, particularly housing and transport, I think it's going to be very challenging, because you may have a whole generation of women who are educated, who have the skills, who really want those jobs. But if they're not able to migrate safely, if they're not able to find safe accommodation, but I think there's a fourth bit, which is the more complicated one, which I'm trying to sort of attack maybe in my next book, but it'll take time. Is I think men have to just change radically at the workplace. And I think I spent the first sort of 20 years of with the Shah Rukh book thinking about how men and masculinity needs to change in our intimate life, in our interpersonal lives, in our family lives. But I also think men radically have to change at the workplace. And what I mean by that is so many women will tell me that they will drop out or they feel discouraged at work because often the hours that they are putting in are just discounted and dismissed by a kind of boys' club that exists. Not because these are evil men who want to band together to hate on women. I don't think it's that. It's just comfort. I think, a kind of masculinity that's very comfort in the typical office spaces of India it has to be disrupted. There's a comfort in old ways of doing things, right? And if you have a situation where managerial roles continue to still be largely occupied by men, and then we train women to believe that to do well, you need to behave exactly the same way, right, in your managerial roles, then how are we, we have to really feminize, I think, the workplace. And I think that has to change. And I don't fully know how that will change. One way it will certainly change is if there are just many more women in positions of leadership. There's no denying that. Like, just presence makes a huge difference.
Absolutely, 110%. Shana, thank you so much for coming on our show. I hope 2025 turns out to be a great year for you, for me, for all the women in our country. And I can't wait for your next book. You have to tell me when it is out.
I will for sure, Snigdha. You please take care of yourself. Have a wonderful end of year. Happy New Year to you.
Daybreak is produced from the newsroom of The Ken, India's first subscriber focused business news platform. What you're listening to is just a small sample of our subscriber only offerings.
A full subscription unlocks daily long form feature stories, newsletters, and podcast extras. Head to theken.com and click on the red subscribe button on the top of the Ken website.
Today's episode was hosted and produced by Rai Snigdha Sharma, and it was edited by Rajiv Sien.